In the last section, we have had a look at some of the most important invading organisms and their case studies. Those were independent, individual case studies, but one way to look at bioinvasion is to look how organisms have spread across the world and what are the probable causes. To understand that, you got to collate information from different bioregions. And in this section, I will provide you an overview of the invertebrates invasion in the different bioregion and try to understand what probably can cause the invasions of these organisms and how they can be looked at from a bioregion point of view. Now, in order to do that, one has to have a glimpse of the recordings of what is considered as an invading organism. So, in the globe there are several databases. So we made a conscious effort to look at the organisms that have been reported as invading organisms, and here is a list of some of them. You can the most proliferantly used one is the Global Ballast Water Management Risk Assessment Database. There are several ports that participated in this program, and it was funded by the Global Environment Facility, and India too participated in this exercise. So there is a huge amount of data that is available on the native species, alien species, cryptogenic species, and kind of that. In addition to that, there are databases like Australian Introduced Marine Pest Information System and National Exotic Marine and Estuarine Species Information System, the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center. And one has to look at several published literature. In the published literature, generally the academic community or the scientific community, when they go and do some research on the diversity of organisms in their backyard, whenever they find something new, they will report it as first time reported from that region. What is important to know is that when it is being recorded as a first time report from that region, it is not necessarily an invading organism, because it might be your first observation of that organism that could have been living there for several years. In this context, I would caution academicians or scientists who would report new organisms for not having known them earlier as invaders is not a complete task. So, in order to achieve that, you got to really look at where did these organisms belong to, what is their natural spread, and what are the possibilities of that occurring in our waters in the natural environment by in historical perspective. So, one has to take a look at that and then only be able to gauge what kinds of organisms probably could have invaded us in the recent years. So, it is important once again to notify that you need to know what is there in your backyard before you illustrate what is actually invading us. So, having taken a careful look at all these databases, I will provide you a glimpse of what is there in the international scenario. You can take a look at this map and then you will see that the red dots and the stars that are there in the different regions are indicative of the reporting of invasive invertebrate species from in their respective bioregion. The diameter of these circles indicate the number of invasive organisms reported from their region. It is very clear that if you look at this part of the world, which is Hawaii and the west coast of the US, you can have a lot numbers reported as invasive, and you can also see in the northern part of the US west coast there is considerable reporting of invasive species. So is the case in the east coast of the US. So is the case in the European waters, especially in the Mediterranean. But if you look at the Asian region, and especially the Southeast Asia and the South Asia and the Indian subcontinent, you can see the numbers drastically reducing to a minimal number. There possibly can be two reasons. Either the habitat in which we are looking for invasive organisms is so rich that invasive organisms find it very difficult to get a foothold, or the research that is carried out in these areas looking for invasive organisms is very meager. So, if you forgive that drawback and if you conclude that these are the actual situation, you can see that mostly in the tropical belt, the capability of the invasive organism to get foothold appears to be less. Nevertheless, much more effort is required to see whether this can be overcome by the strength of the invasive organism. From a phylum perspective, you can see in this pie chart that the maximum invasions have taken place through the spread of mollusks and the spread of arthropods. And there are a couple of examples of ctenophores, annelids, platyhelminthes, ectoprocta, echinodermata. Though the number is very less, it caused devastating effects in Australian waters, Cnidaria, Porifera and Urochordata. If you carefully look at this phylum perspective of invasions, you can easily point out that the spread of mollusks and arthropods are going to be the greatest in terms of phylum in the context of the phylums. Now, let us look at how and why mollusks can spread easily. Mollusks generally have a larval stage which is a veliger, which does not require a particulate or a food that is to be fed through planktotrophy. It can actually feed on dissolved organic matter. Whereas the crustaceans, that is the arthropods, is another major invading organism, has an exoskeleton and requires particulate material. But the vectors that are responsible for transfer of these organisms can facilitate their transfer through many other modes other than just by simple dispersal through currents. So, now we can understand that in spite of very wide diverse organisms being available in the animal kingdom or the plant kingdom, among the invasive invertebrates, mollusks and arthropods take the major chunk of the invasive threats in the different parts of the world. Now, one has to look at how strong would be an invasive species' capability to settle and establish itself in an alien environment. So, I am giving you an example of a crustacean organism. For example, in this case I am illustrating with the example of barnacle, which independently produces thousands of larvae week after week. But what ultimately happens in the ecosystem or the open ocean systems is that over a period of time, this larval pool gets drastically reduced through different processes to ultimately become one single individual again. And these are various factors which determine the strength of the recruitment of an organism. So, in the context of the bioinvasion, we got to understand that it is not merely an introduction that actually facilitates the establishment of an organism in an alien environment. It is also important to see how many of them or the quantum of those organisms that were introduced or the propagules of them being repeatedly being introduced to an environment takes an important point of view for invasion ecology. For example, if an invading organism is not taken to the right habitat, probably it will not be able to get a hold in the new environment and vanish as unwanted or unsuccessful organism in that environment. So, while understanding that you probably can bring in different kinds of organisms, it is also important to know how much of those or how frequently they are brought in to an environment is an important consideration in bioinvasion ecology. And in that context, I will speak a little more about the vectors that are responsible for invasion in my next few slides. Thank you very much.